Hello, everyone, and welcome to our June 2021 convening of the annual Hurlbut-Walker Memorial Research Forum. I am Kimberly Springle, the museum director, and I am honored to join in conversation with a special guest that I will introduce you all to shortly. Before we get into our conversation, I want to share a little bit of background about the forum, especially for our newcomers. The Hurlbut-Walker Memorial Research Forum was founded in 2016 and takes place each year at Sumner School Museum and Archives during the summer months to honor Richard L. Hurlbut, founding director curator of the Sumner Museum, and James Dent Walker, Sumner Museum's first professional archivist. In addition to honoring their pioneering efforts in building the historic collection at Sumner, the purpose of the forum is to share with the public some of the extraordinary collaborations and projects that have been developed by public researchers using materials and documents from the collection. Previous forums have featured presentations by filmmakers, authors, students, and community leaders, among others. All of these people have found valuable resources within the Sumner Museum archives and created respected work as a result. The intent is to shine a light on the importance and significance of the collection and inspire others to come in and use the research library. This year marks the 35th anniversary of the Sumner School Museum and Archives. And this year's series is a little different. This museum, this summer, we will mark the anniversary year by reflecting on the origins of Sumner Museum, the evolution of the collection and mission, and the future. So be sure to stay connected with us. Today, we kick off the series with a special guest. At this time, I would like to welcome and introduce you all to Anatol Steck, who was one of the first members of the staff at Sumner Museum. Anatol Steck is a native Washingtonian. From 1987 to 1999, he worked as a research assistant and museum specialist at the Sumner School Museum and Archives. He joined the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1999, where he serves as senior project director in the International Archival Programs Department of the National Institute for Holocaust Documentation. Mr. Steck grew up in Vienna, Austria, and holds a master's degree in archival and information science from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. At this time, I want to welcome you all welcome Anatol to the platform. Hi, Anatol, how are you doing?
Hello, Kimberly. Thank you for having me on this occasion of the 35th anniversary of Sumner School Museum. Good to be with you today.
Thank you for joining. It's always wonderful to see you. I think we last had you in person on site during the 25th anniversary, which was...
Well, it was a long time ago, yes.
Yes, it was a decade ago. Time flies. But what I do know is I've been at Sumner now for 13 years, and your reputation precedes you. All of the staff that's been there for a while, they remember you very fondly, and they were excited to learn that we were going to speak with you today. So I want to kick off the conversation by going back in time a little bit. And could you share with us how you learned about the Sumner Museum, and when did you start? How did you learn about the museum, and give us a little bit about your origins of working there?
Well, as you mentioned, I grew up in Vienna, Austria, but I was born in Washington, D.C. So I'm a native Washingtonian, and I always wanted to go back to Washington. And so I had that opportunity in 1987. I was 20 years old, and through a very good family friend, Bill Webb, who was actually the official photographer of DC Public Schools and the teacher, I learned about a summer internship. And so I applied, and I was lucky enough to get it. And this was for an architectural survey of the historical school buildings in DC. And at the end of the summer, the internship actually developed into what was first a part-time job as a research assistant, and then a full-time job, which in the end I stayed for some over 10 years with the Sumner School Museum, and it was a very formative period of my life and my career.
Excellent. We're going to talk a little bit about the formation of the collection in a minute, but you mentioned Bill Webb as your connection, your initial connection to the Sumner Museum. And we talked about this, but for everyone who's watching, Bill Webb was the official photographer for DC Public Schools. And when he retired in 1991, he left his entire collection to the museum. And we have representative images that really detail the life and school culture of DC Public Schools from about 1968 to his retirement in 1991. It's one of the most incredibly rich collections, and we're grateful for his contribution. And I will note that there's another image. He and Mr. Hurlbut, who we'll also talk about later, and who is part name of this forum, went to Wilson Teachers College together. They were classmates and friends.
And Kimberly, if I also might add that Bill came from a long line of DC educators, and his mother, the Webb Elementary School, is actually named after his mother. I think her name was Ruth Webb.
Yeah, Ruth Kinser Webb. And you would be happy to know there's been some changes within DC Public Schools. So the Webb Elementary School closed. And so there was actually supposed to be, I think, a conjunction of the name on another school on, I think, Neal Street Northeast. But there's now a charter school, the Ruth K. Webb School. And those folks at the Ruth Webb, now charter school on Mount Olivet Road, they were very conscientious and interested in continuing that legacy. So you'd be happy to know that they have like her image and likeness, and they honor her as the namesake still. A lot of times when schools close, the names, you know, they just go into the history at Sumner. So they continued that legacy. So
oh, that's great to hear.
Bill Webb was born into DC Public Schools.
Exactly.
Also, Anatol, you mentioned this, that you worked as a research assistant, and you helped, well, you didn't mention her name, but there was someone else who you worked with, Dr. Tony Lee.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she was the architectural historian in charge of this project. And what we would do is that summer in 1987, we would travel throughout DC, photographing and documenting the historical schools, many of which had fallen into disrepair and were standing empty at that time. So this survey was also very much a rescue effort in terms of documenting the rich architectural history and the infrastructure that DC has in its historical school buildings. And what this meant was often we would enter an empty building, not knowing what we would find there. And sometimes, and that was actually the start, I think, of my interest also in collecting and archiving, because sometimes we would find yearbooks and other memorabilia which were neglected, lying in the basement or in a cabinet. And then subsequently, we would transfer those to what was the beginning of the Sumner Archives. Now, the Sumner Archives had already been established, but it was not yet actively collecting. And I think the start of Sumner actively collecting memorabilia associated with the history of DC Public Schools can also be traced back to 1987 and this architectural survey that was done at the time. And
that is wonderful. This is great institutional history for me to understand, because those beautiful photographs, those wonderful photographs, historic photographs, as you know, are part of the collection now. And there's been other movements in the early, well, around 2012, 2014 or so. There are school modernization projects that were happening all throughout the city. And so another, I guess, patron of the archives are architects who come in, because there is a desire to maintain some of the historic integrity of the building. So without the work that you and Tony did collectively, they would not be able to see these images and see what the doors formerly looked like and all of that. Even if they're gonna transfer the property to like another use. They still want to honor the historic integrity. So those images, we get a lot of architectural firms who reach out to us, and those photographs have been incredibly useful.
And many of these historical schools, as we all know, have since been converted into condos and for private use, etc. So this way, at least the history and the origins of the building and what it represents are preserved.
Absolutely. I did want to say too, something I did not realize that I just learned from you is how much collecting took place as you all went out to do photographic surveys of the building. You know, the collection is rich and full of items, and sometimes there are questions about, well, where did this come from? And so my understanding of the building survey is you went around the city, took photographs, and then you're gone. So this is really, again, excellent institutional history to add to what we know about many of the origins of the collections coming from these empty school buildings. That sounds like fun.
The collecting was incidental to the survey. It's just that when we came across material, then we picked it up, we made sure that it was preserved, brought to Sumner. And as you know, Kimberly, a lot of collecting is serendipitous. People hear about Sumner, people bring in their memorabilia. I remember at one time when I was in the archives at Sumner and somebody came in, a citizen, and he had 2 school banners of Armstrong High School, which he had found in the city dump, because he actually was, he had a pickup truck. He would pick up things and then dispose of them for a fee at the city dump. And he came across these 2 school banners made out of felt from the old Armstrong High School, and thought about Sumner and brought them in. And they were rescued literally from the trash. So a lot of the rescue of material, and I find this also now in my current job, is serendipitous and is opportunistic. And one often has to seize the opportunity when one finds it before the opportunity is gone. Absolutely.
That happens still today, where people walk in and just learn about us, and they've acquired materials or found it literally in the trash. So yes, and then me too, when I'm around, I carry boxes in my car. We'll talk about the legacy of Hurlbut in a little bit, but I always am prepared. You just never know where you'll find things that are going to be pertinent and valuable to the collection. So that's awesome. So we talked a little bit about you at the Sumner. You arrived there in 1987, and your start was really working with Tony Lee in this historic survey. What other things did you do there while over your 10-year tenure at the Sumner Museum? Who else did you work with? What other kind of interesting stories and activities did you participate in as a staff member?
Well, not long after the architectural survey was completed, the official archivist came on board, James Dent Walker, who was a genealogist specializing in African-American history, and who took over the archives and started actually developing and building the archives based on its core collections, which Sumner at that time already had. And I became his research assistant. So the collecting efforts continued. And over time, I became also a museum specialist because, and this is something we will probably talk about, we were a very small and diverse staff, and it was really at all times, it was all hands on deck. Because as you know, and Sumner still to this day has many functions. Besides a museum and archives, it is also a gallery space, a community meeting place, a cultural center. So there were many functions taking place on a daily basis, on an ongoing concurrent basis. And so it was really us as a small staff all working hand in hand together to make things happen. So working with James Dent Walker was for me a very, very valuable learning experience to learn from his long-time all-life career as a genealogist, as an archivist, historian, was very formative for me because I learned the value of organizing materials, describing them, and also serving the public under his tutelage.
Excellent. You talked about, we've talked about a few people, Bill Webb and his legacy there, Tony Lee, who we still connect with, she still does research in the collections. James Dent Walker, who I never had the privilege of meeting, but have interacted with his wonderful wife, Barbara Walker, who actually taught at the Sumner School as a teacher when it was an active school. So that legacy is there as well. But I'd like to hear about some of the other people. Do you remember other staff member? Who else did you work with over that decade? And what was the staff structure like? How many people worked there, and what was the staff size at that point? How did things run and function?
Well, as I mentioned, we were a relatively small staff, although I know now Sumner has an even smaller staff than we did then. I think it was about 6 or 7 people that worked for Sumner. There was a director of educational programming, a exhibit curator, the chief of the maintenance crew, and there were actually 2 shifts of maintenance crews that came in on a daily basis, because Sumner was operational and functioning from early in the morning till late at night at that time, including weekends. So there were 2 maintenance crews that would come in for 2 shifts. And of course, there was Nancy Suggs, the administrator of Sumner School Museum, who we called Mama Nancy endearingly, and who was like a mother to us all. And we had also an engineer who made sure that Sumner was running smoothly and repaired what needed to be repaired. And like on a ship, an old building always is in need of a tweak here and there and a repair. And of course, our director, Richard Hurlbut, who we all respectfully refer to as Mr. Hurlbut. And who was a very, very kind man and also a real character. And it is really thanks to him that, in large part to him, that Sumner was preserved. Because as you know, originally the city wanted to actually tear down Sumner in the early 80s, which had fallen into disrepair, which was falling apart. And in fact, in the Great Hall, the reception hall on the top floor of Sumner, which is now named in honor of Mr. Hurlbut Hall, it was in such bad shape that pigeons were flying in through the rafters and the roof was in danger of caving in. Right. So the city at the time did not see much of a value in Sumner and moved to tear it down. And it was thanks to Mr. Hurlbut and a group of concerned citizens and preservationists that the building was in the end saved. At one point, and this precedes my time at Sumner, but at one point there was actually a human chain that was formed around the building to prevent the wrecking ball from coming down, while some of the group raced down to the DC Superior Court to get an injunction so that the building could be preserved for another weekend or another few days. Eventually, the building was put under historical preservation status. And then it was thanks to Mr. Hurlbut that the building was not only saved, but also restored, renovated, and that it now serves the functions that it does.
Yes, that's an incredible story. I do want to talk about that movement and Richard Hurlbut, but I wanted to hang on to, you mentioned Nancy Suggs, and so I want to raise her name. I hadn't heard Mama Suggs before, but that is thing. And I worked with her in transition for 4 months before moving into the director position. So Nancy Suggs became the director curator after Mr. Hurlbut passed away. But Mr. Hurlbut, I've heard so many stories about him, you know, his personality, from all sorts of people, from former educators, even from Boston Property senior staff, just talked about, you know, how giving he was. But the story that I heard and have repeated in my tours is that Mr. Hurlbut threatened to stand on the rooftop when the wrecking ball was coming, you know, which makes for a dramatic story. And then this is dramatic as well, with this human chain, all of which is true. And I always emphasize, after giving that dramatic piece of detail, that he did not just threaten to stand on the rooftop, or people, they actually took action and organized to save this building. So you talked a little bit about that. It's very important as we're coming up. So we're celebrating 35 years this year of the Charles Sumner School Museum and Archives that was created out of this movement to save this historic school. And next year, 2022, marks 150 years of the historic Charles Sumner School turns 150, and we're still standing, thankful to Richard Hurlbut's efforts. So I want you to share a little bit more about what it was like to work with Richard Hurlbut. Tell us a little bit about his personality, how he approached the building, how he, what his passions were associated with the building after the movement, because you came in 1987. The Sumner Museum has been up and running for about a year. Mm-hmm. I just want to get a sense of how he was to work with and how he engaged with the site.
Well, I mentioned earlier that Mr. Hurlbut was a kind man, a very kind man, and also a real character. And Mr. Hurlbut, he had dedicated his whole life to DC public schools. He literally worked 7 days a week, and he had his own work schedule. I mentioned that Sumner School was operating from morning until late at night. So the staff came in around 9 a.m. Mr. Hurlbut would come in around 3, and he would actually work until 11 or later at night. So that was his work schedule. And and I want to also mention that when it comes to the archives, it is also thanks to Mr. Hurlbut and his vision that he created the core collection that later became the archives and the foundation for the archives. So the core collection consisted of the Board of Trustees of Education minutes that were bound, and which Mr. Hurlbut had transferred from the central administration offices where they were not accessible to Sumner School so that they could be made accessible. As probably many of our viewers know, before Home Rule, DC public schools were administered, like the city itself, by a board of trustees or commissioners. And those bound minutes were transferred to Sumner, including with the all-important handwritten card files that were organized by subject, so that you could actually find in the minutes exactly what topics were discussed and when, and that you could actually then access them. And that is one part of the core collection that Mr. Hurlbut brought to Sumner. And the other one is his personal files. Mr. Hurlbut was in the habit of saving things. He was also a collector himself throughout his life. And he gathered anything and everything that he felt was important to keep and made sure that it had a home at Sumner School. So these are memos, reports, ephemera that were distributed within DC public schools that nobody might actually think of saving, but that can now give a historian a very good insight into how DC public schools operated. And they go back all the way, I think, to the 60s, if not even the 50s. And what I also want to mention is that when you visit Sumner, and I would encourage everybody to do so who hasn't yet done so, when you enter it, it's a beautiful building inside, and you can see a lot of antiques. Well, some of those antiques are memorabilia from the schools, such as silver trophies or framed photographs, portraits, etc. But you will also notice things, odd things, like, for instance, on the second floor is a crank organ, like a Wurlitzer from the 19th century that has metal discs that spin and it plays melodies. Well, these are antiques that Mr. Hurlbut actually bought out of pocket. So a lot of the antiques that you see at Sumner School, Mr. Hurlbut bought with his own money, and without any official record or anything, he just donated it to Sumner and donated it to DC public schools. So Mr. Hurlbut literally poured his whole being and his whole identity into working for DC Public Schools, but also into the Sumner School Museum, which ultimately has now become his legacy. And I'm very, very glad that his name is officially recognized with a portrait that hangs in what is now known as the Hurlbut Hall at Sumner School.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. It's very evident, you know, all these years later, how much love he poured into the site and saving it. And I feel that responsibility, the burden of it every single day. You know, just how special the place is and how the love and passion he poured into it is so relevant to residents all throughout the city. It's just clear and obvious from how beautifully everything is pulled together. The love that the long-term staff that have been there, maintenance crew, 2 of the members have been there for almost 30 years.
Angie and Jose, I think.
Angie and Jose, and
You'll give them my best.
yeah, I sure will.
They have probably by now the longest institutional memory of all of us.
They do. I tell everybody, I say they run the building. But they have carried on his legacy and have shared these stories with me about Mr. Hurlbut and how much he cared for the building. I think you mentioned another piece about Mr. Hurlbut that I heard before, that every day before entering the building, what would he do?
So as I mentioned before, he would arrive around 3 p.m. And the first thing that he would do, and this was on a daily basis, unless, well, if the weather permitting, but on a daily basis, he would take a taxi to Sumner School because he had a hard time getting around. He was using a cane, so he always took a taxi. And we could set the clock by the time that he arrived at 3 p.m. The taxi would pull up. He would get out of the taxi and he would immediately do an inspection of the outside of Sumner School, the facade, to make sure that everything is in order. And if anything was amiss, he would immediately let us know. And what we usually would do is we would meet Mr. Hurlbut in his office, which was on the top floor, not on the second floor. And we would he would ask us what happened during the day. We'd give him a daily briefing. And if there was anything that he had found, for instance, in the facade that was amiss, he would address that to us. And then pretty much our workday would actually start at 3 p.m. in terms of Mr. Hurlbut being there, although most of us left at 5:30, except the maintenance crew who usually stayed longer. But as I mentioned, Sumner School, there was always a hum at Sumner School because it was really a building that served the community continuously. From 9 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night, including Saturdays and Sundays. Mr. Hurlbut was there 7 days a week. I remember when I had just started working for Sumner School, I would actually make it a habit to join Mr. Hurlbut on Saturdays or sometimes on the Sundays, like once or twice a month. He would invite me, we would have brunch together on a Saturday or Sunday. Nice. Before at, I forget the name of the restaurant, but there was a restaurant just up the street from Sumner School. And we would have brunch, and then Mr. Hurlbut would go to Sumner. I would go my way. So he was there seven days a week. And at one point, I also arranged my schedule so that I worked from Tuesday through Saturday, because, for instance, especially high school students who were working on project for National History Day, or college students would not necessarily be available to come to Sumner during the operating hours during the week. So we also were open on Saturdays, so we could facilitate weekend users and researchers as well. Excellent. So you shared a little bit about how vibrant the museum was. We have served as like a community space and continue in that role, and have many organizations have gotten their start by having meetings and starting the origins. There's like the Pre-Columbian Society, the Committee of 100 used to regularly. There were concerts for over 20 years with Friday Morning Music Club was another group that was there regularly. And all the alumni receptions and reunions that took place. So you can imagine if there's a dozen or so historical alumni, and each one of them had a reunion. That alone is already 10 or 12 big receptions where there were often hundreds of people in attendance.
There was another part of the institutional history in regards to the exhibits that were there. There were many art exhibitions. Do you remember those taking place?
Yes, and this is a very good example of us all working together, because while we had an exhibit curator, installing the exhibits was really a job that involved the maintenance crew, that involved Jack Pyan, the engineer, and that involved me as the museum specialist. So I spent a good deal of time, although I'm afraid of heights, on 8-foot ladders, to the great amusement of Jack, who couldn't understand why I was such a scaredy cat about being on ladders. And we would hang the artwork. And as you know, Sumner has very high ceilings. So what we would use is a technique where we had these, this was also something Hurlbut innovated in terms of these high grade steel rods that were then suspended from the ceiling and that had adjustable brass hooks in the back of them that we used to hang the paintings. And this was done deliberately so that the walls would not be injured through nails or other hanging devices.
We still use those.
Yeah, and they work very well.
They're wonderful. Yeah.
Highest quality. They're made of pure brass. And sometimes when we had exhibits of local artists, Mr. Hurlbut sometimes even paid to have the framing done. And I know that a lot of the official portraits and the permanent, the items that are on permanent display, such as school photographs by Alexander Gardner from the 19th century, etc., these were framed by Mr. Hurlbut. There was a gallery, Michelson's Gallery, at Gallery Place, long gone, of course. The whole area has gentrified.
Yes.
And Mr. Michelson was an alumni of DC Public Schools, and Mr. Hurlbut would commission him and his frame shop to frame many of the artwork and photographs and historical materials which are still on display at Sumner School today. So here too, Mr. Hurlbut personally financed the framing of these items.
Wow.
So exhibits were actually an ongoing part of what Sumner did. So we did not only have exhibits every now and then, we had exhibits on a rolling, I think it was a 3-month schedule. And every room at Sumner, which is also very unique, had artwork displayed. So there was always an audience, because the gallery rooms were also used as meeting rooms on a constant basis. So there were always people in these rooms meeting, as you said, Committee of 100 or others, or ANC groups. And so they could enjoy the art on an ongoing basis. And so we rotated the artwork every 3 or 4 months. And we took about 1 or 2 weeks to install them between the exhibits, because it was a big job. And we also produced the catalogs ourselves. So it was very hands-on, and everybody played their part. And without everybody chipping in, it would not have worked, because there was just simply too much to do all at once, which was a good thing. I mean, that is a very good thing.
So that very much defined the culture of the workspace, very, very team-oriented.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And
awesome.
You often hear a description of work being like family.
Yeah.
Well, that truly applied to Sumner School Museum at that time.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. We talked about many of the earliest collections. Were there any others that anything you wanted to share about the collections? Throughout this series, we highlight various aspects of research that has come out of the collections. So I really want our viewers to get a sense of the holding. So you talked about the foundational pieces, the Board of Education meeting minutes, the Board of Trustees materials, and I must say publicly, those the card catalog, those are gold. Gold treasures. They're so rich. There's so much wonderful information in those board proceedings. I've been doing a lot of remote research because we're closed right now, and you can easily flip through the pages and get distracted. You'll see another name. It's just so rich. They're literal transcripts.
And I remember one particular story where I helped a high school student research on the iconic concert that Marian Anderson gave on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And we found out that after she had been rejected by the Daughters of the American Revolution, not to allow her to sing at Constitution Hall, she or her manager had actually approached the DC Board of Trustees to see if she could sing in one of the reception halls at one of the public schools, and she was rejected there as well. Yeah. And the whole debate behind that and what was said is all in those minutes of the Board of Trustees. And it was then that Marian Anderson sang, and it became this iconic moment in American history, her singing at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. If the Board of Trustees had allowed her to sing in the schools, we probably would not have had this iconic moment. And I think that's just a footnote of history that is buried inside the Board of Trustees minutes. And most historians don't know that there was actually that part of history as well involved in DC public schools.
It's so interesting how that fact, that little piece of information is so, significant to the fuller story, and it's a lesser known fact. And I believe it was Central High School in particular that that they approached about her singing there. And what I later learned, particularly when now Cardozo was renovated, it was my understanding that auditorium, their stage, was the largest one in the city. Point. So it's just a lot of rich history within the DC public education system. That's amazing.
And Sumner School Museum as a building, as an institution, and the archives that it contains of DC public schools, I think also reflects not only the history of DC, but also the history of America as a whole and our society as a whole. Often what was reflected in the DC public schools was also a reflection of what was happening in American society and in terms of political decisions, racial decisions that were being made.
Absolutely.
And the schools, as we know, in DC were segregated until 1954. And the decisions were made by a congressionally appointed Board of Trustees before Home Rule. All these things are reflected in Sumner School, and the building itself and whom it is named after, the Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, who was an abolitionist. He was nearly caned and beaten to death by Preston Brooks, the pro-slavery congressman from, I believe, South Carolina, and I think it was in 1856. So his name also reflects that part of history, and that Sumner School was actually the first brick and mortar building built for African-American students in the District of Columbia, and it was built to the highest standards, architectural and educational standards of the time. So all of these things are reflected in the history of Sumner School, in the collection which Sumner School contains, and what Sumner School still does today by serving the community at large. So it is really an integral institution, I think, in terms of DC and its history.
Absolutely. I'm literally in awe every time I walk into that building so many years later. The history is phenomenal. And again, just extremely grateful to Richard Hurlbut and all the others, named and unnamed individuals who had a hand in ensuring this building was preserved and saved, and just the pioneering efforts of having the audacity to create a museum dedicated to preserving the history of public education in DC. I just think it's astounding. And I'm incredibly honored to serve as a steward of the site and also the collection as well. So is there anything else you want to share about fond memories? You shared a lot about that 10-year period at Sumner and what the work culture was like and how vibrant the space was. You left the Sumner Museum in 1999 and moved on to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And a question I have for you is, how was your early career start at Sumner Museum foundational for the work that you do now and have for the past several years?
Well, it taught me so many things, not just from a professional viewpoint, but also from a personal and philosophical viewpoint. I learned, for instance, that history is dynamic, history is not static, and history is interpersonal. I learned about the archivist being a trustee and the trust that people put into an archivist to preserve these materials. When I think of, for instance, Paul Cook, who was the president of the Teachers College, Minor Teachers College, towards the end of his life, he would bring to us boxes of his personal papers, and they are now part of an archive of Minor Teachers College, because he spent his career at Minor, and it was his entire life's work which he entrusted us and which he entrusted Sumner School. The same with the alumni organizations, who would bring us their memorabilia, not only yearbooks, but also personal documents, letters that they had received and from their teachers, all sorts of material, which is a rich treasure trove for historians today who are interested not only, as I said, in the history of DC Public Schools, but the history of American society and the history of the District of Columbia in particular. So these are some of the lessons that I had the good fortune of learning over those 10 years that I was at Sumner School Museum. And while I was there, I also had the opportunity to go to school in the evenings and finish my my degree in archival and library science. And then in 1999, I have to say with a heavy heart, once I had graduated from Catholic University, I made the decision when I had the opportunity to move on. But I have to say, every time that I walk by Sumner, I still have this lump in my throat, and it's this recognition of what a wonderful time I had at Sumner and what formative years these were, these 10 years that I spent in my 20s working at Sumner School Museum.
Wonderful. We are nearing the end of our conversation. I am thankful to you for sharing your time and your experiences, and thank you for your contributions to building the collection. You are very much a part of that as well.
And Kimberly, let me also say and thank you for continuing Richard Hurlbut's vision, the vision that those had who were involved in saving Sumner and making it a communal facility. And thank you very much for your stewardship and for all the work that you do in continuing Sumner's mission.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. As we near the end, I have a question for you. As I mentioned at the top, this is our 35th anniversary. Anniversary years are a perfect time for reflection. And I just want to ask you, someone who was very closely connected to the building, what is your dream for Sumner Museum? And how would you like to see it evolve into the next 35, 40, 50, 100 years?
Well, I had mentioned earlier the significance of Sumner in terms of what it represents and the history that it represents as an African-American institution. And Sumner is just down the street from Black Lives Matter Plaza. And when we think about the violence which was inflicted about Charles Sumner for being an abolitionist, and whom the school and the building is named after, it resonates today. And I hope that DC Public Schools, and I hope that DC recognizes the treasure and the importance which Sumner School Museum has as an institution. And also the importance of serving the community, because how rare is it to have a building which wears many hats and is not just a museum, not just a gallery, but that actually has a holistic approach and an altruistic approach towards the greater community which it serves. And I think this too makes the Sumner School museum and archives unique, and it is something that is irreplaceable. So I hope that DC, and in particular DC Public Schools, will continue to invest in Sumner as a building, but also in its staff, and that you will receive the full support that you need and deserve to keep this legacy going.
Awesome. Well, again, Anatol, thank you so much for sharing so much of the rich origins of the school into a museum, the museum origins, I'll say, because the school's been around for almost 150 years and has a very rich legacy that has evolved into something wonderful under the leadership of Richard Hurlbut. And you put us right in that space in the 1980s and 90s to show the vibrant origins. And I just want to thank you for your time and for sharing with the viewers a little bit about the history. I learned a lot. There are several things that I'm hearing today for the first time, as I mentioned earlier, that really contribute to the institutional history, which is very important. So I appreciate you for spending the first June 2021 forum with us, honoring Richard Hurlbut and James Dent Walker, who laid the foundation for the collections. And we hope to see you real soon inside the building when we open back up. And yes, we're going to have you in so you can go down memory lane and look at some of these collections you helped assemble.
I can't wait, and I look forward to seeing all the treasures that you have collected since the last time when I visited Sumner, which was far too long ago.
Yes.
And I can't wait to visit it again once the current situation allows. So thank you very much, Kimberly, for having me. And I very much look forward to seeing you in person so that we can look at some of these collections that you have brought in.
Absolutely. I can't wait. Thank you so much, Anatol.
Thank you, Kimberly.